So, TellTale. When I say that name, what do you think of? Okay, but what do you actually think of game-wise? Because you probably immediately thought of either of these 4 games. The Back to the Future game, Poker Night, Wolf Among Us, or probably their most popular series, their version of The Walking Dead. Now, I say version despite these games maybe or maybe not being canon to the comic universe, but point is, their Walking Dead games are probably, if not the most popular series the company was known for, and for good reason, with a masterpiece of a first season that is just the best one out of the whole series, with its characters and writing, and probably what you thought of when I mentioned TellTale's Walking Dead, followed by a somewhat decent second season. If you side with Kenny, I cannot stand Jane. I hate her. I hate her so much, dude. But speaking of hate, New Frontier, or the 3rd season. Javier is cool. I like that they included more comic stuff, like mentioning the kingdom and having Jesus, the character. Aside from that, this season was not good. And the writing especially, taking a nosedive and mountains upon mountains of cut content. Hell, one of the screenshots when the game was first revealed doesn't even show up. This one. This is in the Slaughterhouse, a section that I'm 99% confident in saying we have all the assets aside from dialogue and code for gameplay. But if it wasn't apparent, this game was a mess. And that is most likely due to TellTale at the time struggling. Now, it's not to say they weren't making good or great games, because they absolutely were. With the 2 Batman games, their Guardians game, which admittedly I know little about, but was apparently good. And apparently Tales from the Borderland was good too, which I find hard to believe because it's a Borderlands. But point is, there were good games being made. But with that all being said, were there any games that could have been made that were canceled and that could have maybe saved the company? Well, yes, actually, for the canceled part. But what were those games? Well, the 2 least interesting were a Untitled game and a sequel to their Game of Thrones game, which I completely forgot they made. A different version of Wolf Among Us 2, which, to quote In the Cold Blood, a popular TellTale Games person who has uncovered the content for mainly the Walking Dead games, and who leaked the screenshots of TellTale Wolf 2, made Bigby look like an alcoholic. And yeah, they're not off. But the last game, and the actual game the video is about, is a Stranger Things game, and that I'm surprised hasn't been attempted to be revived since Stranger Things is still popular, and the new TellTale reviving Wolf 2. So why hasn't this one also been revived? But I'm getting ahead of myself. So today I'm going to be covering the canceled Stranger Things game by TellTale and seeing what could have been potentially. But before we begin, if you enjoy this and want more like it, subscribe. You know, the basic YouTuber junk. Alright, with that out of the way, let's start with... I promise this is important, trust me. But before we talk about what didn't happen with the brand, we can talk about its own games, and it in other games, which isn't a lot, actually. Starting with mobile games, there's a surprisingly low amount, with only 2 up on the App Store, at least. There was a 3rd game that was apparently a puzzle matching game, but it doesn't seem to be up anymore. But with that done, let's now talk about the main crossovers with Stranger Things. The first, and actually least interesting, is Fortnite. Stranger Things in Fortnite was in Chapter 1, Season 10, and was back when collabs were pretty simple and not these big events with half the season dedicated to it. The Megazord is still really cool and funny, but the collab was just the Demogorgon and David Harbour. There was also little portals from the series that were at one location, so that's neat, but that's pretty much it. There hasn't been any more Stranger Things content in Fortnite since then. But now for the one you probably have heard more about, and that is Stranger Things and Dead by Daylight. This is probably the most popular Stranger Things collab, but probably not for the reasons you think. But what is the content? Well, the collab was one killer, one map, and two survivors. The killer, the Demogorgon. The map, Hawkins Labs, and the survivors, Joe Keery and Nancy. Which is pretty cool, especially when, at the time, it was the latest content after Season 3. Released on top of the fact the series was only 3 years old at the time, and was already in a game alongside big horror characters like Michael, Ghostface, and the worst version of Freddy, but at least he's here to some degree. But all that is probably not the main reason this collab was talked about. You probably know about it more for its removal. In November 2021, the chapter would get removed from Dead by Daylight. The reason being, the content licensing expired. Yeah, not that exciting than I originally thought. The chapter did get re-added in, funnily enough, November of 2023, with a new licensing agreement, which has caused people, anytime there's a new licensed chapter, to speculate if it's going to be a second Stranger Things chapter. But that's an entirely different discussion. So I think it's time we actually get into the topic of the video. So let's start with... So, when was this game in development? Well, from what I could find, it seems like the earliest point of the game's existence was either mid-2016 or mid-2017. I say or because on the Stranger Things fandom wiki, it says the game was first pitched in mid-2016 after the first season premiered, but was rejected by, I'm assuming, TellTale themselves. Because later on, the wiki, they mentioned that after a change in leadership in 2017, TellTale and Netflix did partner up, which that part did happen. So my best guess is early ideas and pitches were made in 2016, but didn't go anywhere. But after the change in leadership at TellTale, a partnership with Netflix was able to happen. And in 2018, more details started to emerge for it. Like, the game was possibly the first TellTale game made in Unity, but the game would end up cancelled with TellTale closing in 2018. That's my best attempt at putting together a timeline of this game, with the rest of the information on the fandom wiki being accurate to the Wikipedia for both TellTale games and Stranger Things. There was gameplay leaked for it on September 23rd, 2018, which we will get to later. But aside from that, the game was planned to have come out in 2019, according to Eric Stribe. I don't know how to pronounce his name. A writer who worked on The Walking Dead Season 2 and Minecraft Story Mode. The last bit of the timeline is that in October 2020, Ants Amino and Wellis, composers of both Minecraft Story Mode seasons, uploaded 6 tracks they made for the game. But that's it for the timeline. There was a bunch of concept art and models, but I'll get to that after. I did mention this, but there was gameplay that leaked shortly after the company closing, which looks... well, we'll get to the models later. But what happens in said gameplay? Well, the first part of it is in Will's house, with Joyce on the phone with a character named Dr. Owens. For reference, I've only seen the first season, but I do know a little bit of what happens in Season 2 and 3, which, funny enough, the game was planned to be set in between those seasons. But getting back to the footage, Will walks around the house and opens a drawer that has a battery, before it jump cuts to Will opening his birthday presents, and it being a TRS-80, according to the subtitles. Gives us a look at the dialogue options, and how they may have looked. I say may, but I'll get to that again later. But continuing, the footage jump cuts again, now to the player hiding under something in the upside down from the Demogorgon, before jump cutting again down in a different hallway and getting seen by the Demogorgon, and starting, I assume, a chase sequence before the footage ends, before said possible chase sequence starts. So, a few key takeaways from this. The one major one is the models. They look not bad, but not great. The best comparison I can give is that they look like Disney Infinity models, especially the Demogorgon and Hopper. While some look alright with Winona Ryder, another thing is the chase sequence. Now, I say chase mainly because of the effect that shows up on the screen. But what's interesting is that it's in first person and is in a more traditional chase sequence. Not that there haven't been sorta chase sequences in TellTale games, but the closest ones is where you have to do a task quickly while a effect is on the screen, and if you fail, you die. Best example is in the Walking Dead games. But with this being a more traditional style, I do have my own speculation on the scene and the gameplay itself, but I'll get to that after the next section. So, this is probably the biggest part of this whole thing, with all the concept art and models for some characters, and menu and UI/potential gameplay mechanics. But with how big this part is, how am I going to tackle it? Well, I'll be covering some in their own sections, so if you only care about one character or characters, you can skip to that chapter. But with that out of the way, let's start with the menu for the game. So, starting with the main menu for the game, there's only really 4 technical different menu concepts, with slight differences for a few of them. The first is pretty simple, with a red shape that has Will and a walkie in it, with the menu options at the bottom. The few differences is some having the background in a dark forest, changing up where some things are on the menu. There is one with red lines on the side that I do like. The second one differentiates itself by having 2D art with the main 4, David Harbour, and this other character that I have a guess on who this is, but I'll save it for when we get to their model. The only difference is different placement for the selection options, art, and the logo. The third is probably the most simple, with it just having a circle with Will in his house and him in the upside down, and the difference is them being flipped. The fourth and final is probably the most interesting, with it actually having a mock-up animation for the game upon opening it, and the menu itself going from outside of Will's house, then into it, before being on a asleep Will. I'm assuming that the images are all concept art of these areas. But with that done, I do want to talk about a few pieces by the artist for the menus, John Montenegro. I don't know how to pronounce that last name. And those being the UI and gameplay mechanic concepts. The first being on a image of, I'm assuming, Mike and one of his concept art pieces, with written under him that this is meant to be a missing cat poster. But the main thing is the text next to it, saying, "Clue added, a lot of animals have gone missing lately. I wonder why." There's other concept art pieces that back up having a journal and piecing clues together being a mechanic or the main mechanic, with the second image showing the journal itself, with, I'm assuming, different placeholder images in the place of actual photos meant to be used. But the header saying Hellhounds, there is new text on the page that says, Journal clues! You've solved a mystery! Here are the clues you found that were related to Hellhounds, i.e. demo dogs. There is a similar image, but the text is slightly different, saying, Journal clues! Link the relevant clues together to solve the mystery, and unlock new story options / dialogue, with dialogues spelled incorrectly, which is a little funny to me. The last one of these don't have much, just showing a different page of the journal, with the text and heading saying Dossier. I didn't mention this before, but some of the journal images have placeholder text at the bottom, and all of them have, I'm assuming, concept art of Jonathan's bedroom as the background for some reason. There's also a piece of, I'm assuming, using a camera mechanic that shows a clearer image of said concept art. But with that out of the way, let's move on to the characters, starting with the one that has the least is Dustin. What do I mean? Well, aside from a piece that has all 4 of the boys, he doesn't have a single piece of art from what I could find. But he does have a model that we can see in one close-up. One, I'm guessing, is his model reference sheet, and the last one in a lineup with Will, Lucas, Joyce, and Hopper. But moving on to the one that doesn't have a model, from what I could find, is Mike. Mike has one piece of him by himself, one of his reference sheet, and him in a different outfit, plus the one I mentioned of the 4 in the woods. Now, the only reason I can think of for Mike not having a model is probably they just didn't get around to him before the game got canceled, which makes me wonder if there was more to the gameplay we saw, if the other 3 got models, hell, if Steve got modeled. Moving on to the next one, Lucas. He has one piece of him by himself, one of his reference sheet, and one of him normally, and one with him in a different outfit with his bandana and slingshot. The images of his model are similar to Dustin's close-up, one of his model reference sheet, and the last, again, him in the lineup. The last one being Will. I think he has the most of the 4. The first being one piece by himself, one of him in different outfits, which is notable that none of them are the ones Will has in the forest art. One being a close-up of his face, which I guess was probably the first or one of the first pieces of him made, at least. His models have one of him in a casual outfit, and same one has a close-up. And his model in pajamas, which was actually the one in the gameplay. And finally, him in the lineup. And with that, that was the main 4 boys. I do find it interesting that 3 of the 4 have models, especially with Dustin. I imagine has concept art made but not released. While Mike has concept art, but either a model was made and, again, not released, or his just didn't get made. I find that interesting because of the next character that, again, does have a model. So I'll keep this part brief because he doesn't have a lot, but Steve does have something. One piece of concept art that has both a piece with him by himself and his reference sheet, and one close-up of his model. Again, there isn't much to say, but again, it makes me wonder if there was more to that gameplay video. Like, it definitely wasn't the final version of it, but it potentially being an alpha or beta version of an episode 1 that had Steve and the other characters present to some degree is possible. And we probably will never know, but we should move on to the next characters. Starting off with Joyce, she has a concept art piece that is the same as Steve's. She has a model reference sheet, and she does have a close-up of her model, but what's different is she's in a, I assume, idle pose, or maybe just her pose in the lineup. But I find it interesting that she's the only one like this. Moving on to Hopper, he does have a piece of art, but that's not like the rest, with his being him in different poses and having one with his hat. The models are the same with a reference sheet and one close-up. 11 is similar to Mike, where she only has a concept art piece, even less than Mike with only having one piece of art and nothing else. Speaking of, that's pretty much it for the main cast of characters. So I think we should move on to the NPC characters, I think. I say think because none of them resemble any notable characters, and the only two I think are notable I will bring up in a little bit. I don't have much to say about the rest, so I'll probably just have the images on screen while I talk here or after. I do find it a little funny the old man had his alternate heads also modeled. But moving on to the two notable ones. The first being this guy with a Hawkins High shirt that's definitely seen better days. The only reason I'm signaling him out is because he does have one piece of concept art more in line with the main cast members, and a model reference sheet also more in line with the main cast. Aside from that difference, it's unknown what his purpose will be. I do think he could have been or had a more significant role in the story potentially as like a reoccurring side character, but that's speculation on my part. The other NPC is this scientist guy, I think. He doesn't have any concept art, but he does have a model and 3 different variations of it. The first 2 having slight to minimal changes. The third having his clothes torn up. He also shows up in one of the alternate menus, implying he might have been an important character. Now, who he is unknown. But if I had to speculate, my best guess is maybe Dr. Brenner. My only evidence is with the game being set in between seasons 2 and 3, and him apparently still being alive, with a character in season 2 supposedly saying this. Again, I haven't seen season 2 yet to confirm this, but if that's true, then it's possible TellTale wanted to tie up Brenner's story in this game, but again, I'm only guessing. The last model here is just the Demogorgon, who surprisingly doesn't have concept art, but has a model reference in a close-up. And I don't know why, but the Demogorgon model specifically reminds me of a Disney Infinity model, and I cannot explain why. The last thing I want to go over is this weird, I don't really know what this is. I found it on the ArtStation account for the menu concept arts, but if I had to guess, it was maybe dialogue for someone who would talk while you're in the journal menu. But what is the context for this? I don't have a single clue. But with all the images out of the way, let's move on to our final thing, and that is... Now, I mentioned that the composers did upload it in 2020, but what's notable is that it gives us names for some of the tracks. I'm not going to play any of the tracks here, but I will link it in the description, which I recommend you listen to because these are pretty good. But the names of the tracks go as follow: Will's Nightmare, Walkies, Islands in the Sky, 11th Hour, Smoke, and Rebuilding Castle Buyers. Now, what the context of these are is unknown, more so with the gameplay, but the only one I can link to is Will's Nightmare, maybe being for the part that shows the Demogorgon, that maybe the gameplay was a nightmare Will had when he was in the Upside Down, and the track would have played during that entire sequence, or maybe just the chase part. The only other tracks I could maybe link together is Walkies, maybe for the main 4 boys when they use their walkies. Smoke maybe being for Hopper as sort of a Steam since he's commonly seen smoking. 11th Hour maybe being for 11, but the only thing I have linking them is just her name and literally nothing else. Also, something else of note is that in the beginning of the video, there's a laptop that gives us a little more background information on the game. Mainly that they were offered to compose for a unannounced game and were sent 8 minutes of footage, which is interesting to me. Mainly that there's 8 minutes of footage for the game out there. Whether if it was the final or close to a final build, or alpha or beta version is unknown. So that's about everything there is for the game, outside of my own personal speculation. I still do wonder if the game would have maybe or maybe not saved TellTale around that time, but maybe kept them around a little longer. Now, I do wonder if this game will ever get revived, because TellTale is back and are making Wolf Among Us 2, which was cancelled but now revived. The thing is though, is it's unknown what is actually going on with both that game and TellTale. What I mean is, in interviews with Ad Hoc Studio, the people who you probably know for Dispatch, and for good reason, but they did work on Wolf Among Us 1 while at TellTale before founding the studio, and they were co-developing Wolf 2 and wrote the story, but according to them, production was stopped and they had to move on to working on Dispatch to keep the company open. So what does that mean for the Stranger Things game possibly getting revived? It's most likely not a possibility with TellTale, at least. I did find this Eurogamer article from September 24th, 2018, saying how Netflix still wants a Stranger Things game in an interactive game format. If that is still the case today, I don't know. But if you ask me, I think if it were to be made, Ad Hoc would probably be the best option, mainly with Dispatch's success and the unknown status of TellTale working on Wolf 2. But hey, it could be worse. They could have Deck 9 working on the game.